Hello and welcome to the Learning to Slay the Beast podcast, a resilience podcast where we talk about all the challenging things that we're working to overcome, like anxiety, health, and relationship issues. My name is Sarah. I am quickly learning that parenting tweens and teens, which I haven't ventured into yet, is very challenging. It can be made even more challenging when your tween or teen has their own challenges like physical, mental health, or learning challenges. I can totally identify with this experience as I have a tween that I've talked about several times with PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infections. Today, we're going to dig a little bit more into parenting tweens or teens during those difficult times. I'm excited to welcome Helen Wills, who is a blogger at Actually Mummy and has a podcast aimed at taking the fear out of parenting teens called Teenage Kicks Podcast. Helen's going to give us some information on what she has learned walking this journey with her child, and hopefully you will get some great tips today. Enjoy this interview with Helen Wills. So welcome, Helen, to the podcast. I'm happy to connect with you today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Great. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your background?
Right. Yeah. So I'm a blogger and podcaster, but that is a kind of second career for me. I started out in retail, pub retail. I was an operations director for a big pub retail company here. So I ran, I think I had 120 bars and pubs in central London under my business.
Oh, wow.
And that was a massive full-time 24/7 job. So once I had my children, I couldn't do it, and there wasn't any way to do it part-time. So I just stopped working. We were fortunate enough that I could do that. And I stopped working. And then when my youngest got to be about 3 or 4 years old, I realized that I was definitely going to need something else to stimulate my brain. And so I started blogging. And it's really just gone from there. The blog took off. It's become a source of income for me. And now that my kids are teenagers and they don't want me to write about them anymore, I've branched out to talking about other people's mental health as teenagers through my podcast.
Ah, very good. Yes. Okay. I can imagine that. I know they get a little more particular once they're teens.
Definitely.
That's great. But I mean, obviously great topic, mental health to be, working through, whether it's a guest story or things of your own. So why don't you tell us a little more experience that you've got in terms of parenting? I know you mentioned that your child had health issues and a diagnosis at a younger age. Similarly, I have talked about a lot on the podcast. My son has a disorder called PANDAS, and I've had a number of parents and practitioners on that have talked about the challenges in parenting, when you're dealing with a health issue on top of just kind of the normal parenting stuff. So I wondered if you could give us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, of course. So Maddie, she's 17 now, but she was 9 when she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And for anyone who doesn't know it, it's an autoimmune condition. It's completely unrelated to type 2 diabetes, which tends to get the lifestyle tag. There's nothing we could have done to prevent it. I think it's probably in our family. It does tend to cluster in families. And again, for people that don't know it, because I didn't, it's devastating. It's absolutely life-changing. It's life-threatening, and it's life-threatening at every minute of the day, because essentially, and this is what people don't understand, and I really didn't realize, the insulin that you need to take keeps you alive, but it's also a potentially lethal medication if it's given in the wrong doses. And you don't get told what doses to give when you leave the doctor's room. You get told how to calculate what the best guess would be for the dose, given a myriad different factors, not least of which are the carbohydrate that she's going to eat and the exercise that she's either doing or has already done. But the thing that I didn't realize is that insulin is a hormone, and hormones are interactive. So blood sugar can go up or down depending on what all your other hormones are doing. And normally your pancreas responds and doses perfect amounts of insulin to deal with all of that. But because we're on the outside of the body and we don't know what our hormones are doing, we're always playing catch up and having to second guess it. So it's really, really tough and really scary.
Yeah, wow. It does sound scary. And you're right. Like, as much as I've heard of type 1 diabetes, but the way that you've explained it is definitely not exactly how I understood. So that's really helpful, and sounds like that would be definitely very challenging, especially then with a young child. And, there's the challenges of them communicating how they're feeling, I'm sure. I know my daughter has food allergies, and, we have EpiPens and things like that. But even there, we have a challenge with understanding how she's feeling, right?
Yeah, definitely. And the first time she had a hypo, which is a low blood sugar, which is kind of, that's the most urgent thing to have to deal with. I really kind of helicoptered her for a little while. I kept on saying, well, how do you feel? How does it feel? How are you feeling? Prick your fingers. How are you feeling now? Prick your fingers again. Because we didn't know what to expect, and she didn't know how it was going to feel. And she was scared about that. She had no idea how it was going to feel. And then, of course, when it did happen, it felt horrible. So it's really tough to watch your child at that age, a young age, having to take on board the fact that not only does this feel horrible and happens frequently, it's also never going away. It's never, ever going to get any better. That's a really hard thing to come to terms with, I think. But anyone whose child has got a lifelong diagnosis will probably relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned that you weren't really given a lot of guidance. And I think I could imagine that that's really scary as well. I know I felt that way around the EpiPens, because it was just kind of like, well, when exactly do I use this? There isn't really a cut and dry, and, you think with food allergies that you're going to somehow see them eat it and then know, like, oh, now I can give this and this is what she needs. But it doesn't really work like that. Like, you don't know that it's in the food.
Yeah,
that wasn't what I had worked through. So I can imagine the same on your end. Like, the lack of guidance would have been really tricky.
Yeah, I mean, but when I say lack of guidance, they did the best they could.
Yeah,
everyone who's diagnosed with type 1 diabetes will be told, this is where you start. This is what we think you're going to need, but you do have to calculate. You calculate insulin according to a ratio that they give you. And then between you and them over time, you adjust it up or down, depending on whether it's working or not. And the ratio could be something like 10 grams of carbohydrate to every 1 unit of insulin. So they work that out based on your weight at the time. But as I say, anything can affect it, including hormones that we have no control over. And it changes. So we now 7 years in, we still change Maddie's carbohydrate ratios at least every 2 or 3 weeks when we notice that they're not working anymore. And they can go up or they can go down. It might depend on the weather. When it's very cold, usually people struggle to keep their blood sugar up. So we have to reduce the amount of insulin we give. But we can't do it too soon, because if we do it too soon and we try to preempt this, we could cause high blood sugars, which are also dangerous.
Oh, wow.
So it's very complex.
Yeah, and delicate, it sounds like. And again, cold. I never would have thought of that, but that's really interesting.
Oh, all manner of things. Actually, the hardest time for me was as she hit puberty and really started to grow fast for about 4 years or so. we could literally see that she was growing in her sleep, because she would go to bed with a completely normal blood sugar, with the right doses of insulin, and she'd suddenly be in the high teen. Well, we work differently, but she'd have a very, very high blood sugar that was unsafe to leave alone in the night, and we couldn't get it down for 4 or 5 hours. And then we'd know, because 3 months later at our hospital checkup, she'd have grown 3 centimeters.
Wow.
And that's what we could see. And now that she's 17 and she's not growing so fast, that's much less of a challenge. But she can have low blood sugars in her sleep. And people, in the beginning, people used to say to me, but surely you just take the insulin, avoid the wrong foods, and everything's fine. No, you know what to do. And the answer is no, because we have a conversation every night about, what have you been doing today? How have your bloods been today? Have you done any exercise this evening? How are you feeling? Are you stressed? Are you coming down with a cold? A virus can cause problems. Okay, based on that, what do you think we should do with your insulin overnight? We can have our best guess, and she can still have 3 back-to-back low blood sugars in the night that we weren't expecting. And that's the fear, that you're not even safe while you're asleep. That's the biggest worry.
And so how do you know when she's having an issue at night? Like, is there some type of a monitor that she's on
so we're really lucky. We and I fought for this very early on, as soon as I realized it was a thing. There's a device called a Dexcom, and it's a continuous glucose monitor, and that's what she has. And basically every 10 days she inserts this sensor in her skin. It's attached to a transmitter that is kind of it's stuck to her belly, and every 5 minutes that sends a reading to her phone of what her blood, it can't be 100% accurate, but more or less what her blood sugar is. And because it reads every 5 minutes, it can show a trend. Is it going up? Is it coming down? Does it look like we need to do something soon? And thank goodness for technology, because she has that on her phone. And then, of course, it goes up to the cloud and we can follow it on our phones. So it's been a lifesaver, because we can sleep at night without... It used to be in the early days when she was on finger pricks that I would wake up, and this is really normal for parents of children with type 1 diabetes. I would check her blood sugar before I went to bed at, say, 11 o'clock at night. And I'd set an alarm for 2 or 3 a.m. to go check it again. And depending on what was happening then, I might be up for the next hour, or I could go to sleep until 6. And that's really normal. And I would wake up every morning, and I'm not kidding. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but I know other parents have said the same thing. I'd wake up every morning and my first thought would be, is my child alive? And so this Dexcom has been just a lifesaver, not just for her, but for me too, because I can sleep and I know that if it's working well, it will alarm on my phone and tell me I need to go check.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, that does sound like really revolutionary for sure. And definitely like a super heavy weight for you. I'm sure there's been a bit of a, mental burden, even if I can call it that would go along with that every day, just the uncertainty. And I know I was looking through some of your social media, and you had a post up that, that you had been thinking about the fact that you are always calculating carbohydrates in food. And I thought, wow, that is a big thing to kind of just innately be constantly thinking about. So I wondered if you could kind of talk a little bit about the impact on you as a caregiver that you found in supporting your daughter.
Yeah, it really has taken a toll on me, and it's taking me a long time to recover, and I'm still recovering from it. And I don't think I'd realized, obviously to begin with, the initial shock.
Yeah.
It really was like grief. I've said this before. It feels exactly like the 5 stages of grief. It does feel like losing a child. and starting again with another one, because her life is not the same. It's the same, but it's different in such a big way. So there was that to get through initially. And then, because you do, when it's your kids, right, you want the absolute best for them. So you do I stopped working really for 2 years, and it took 2 years for me to learn everything I could learn about diabetes. And that's all I did. I did nothing for myself. Everything went on the back burner. I counted carbs. I noted down blood glucose levels. I wrote down every item in every meal that she had for nearly 2 years to see because I was so convinced that if I did it perfectly, I would be able to get her into a normal blood glucose range and keep her there. And that would give her the best start in life with this condition. And it took me 2 years, one, to learn everything I needed to know because it's so complicated, and two, to realize that whatever I did, I was never going to be able to control it. And that was a massive emotional realization that I would have to step back and accept that she wasn't going to have normal blood sugars, whatever I did. And that was really hard to take. That said, I knew that I'd done the very best I could. So I knew it wasn't possible. I knew it wasn't my failure. It just wasn't a possibility. But it kind of felt like I had to come to terms with it all over again at that point. And I had to learn to accept kind of widened barriers of what health looked like. Because I don't know how anyone else feels, but for me, I was that mum who had a baby and wanted to make everything perfect. So I was pureeing 25 different types of organic fruit and vegetables for the freezer every week. I wanted her life to be as perfect as it possibly could be. And suddenly I was not in control of that anymore. It wasn't anymore. So when you ask how it affected me, at the end of that 2 years, I think looking back, I'd been running on adrenaline. I was fighting. I was just living with stress. And at the end of that 2 years, when I finally took a big sigh and went, oh, okay, I can't do this. I need to cut us all some slack. That's when my body really kicked in hard and said, right, you've been ignoring me. Time for me to show you that I need some attention too. And the pain I had, and I have fibromyalgia.
Oh, yeah.
The pain I had from fibromyalgia was so intense that I spent the best part of the next couple of years backwards and forwards to doctors trying to resolve that. I've had fibromyalgia for a very long time. I was just listening to your episode on fibromyalgia, actually, and pain. But it was the worst I'd ever had it. And I'm sure it was just my body saying, okay, it's time for us now. Whereas previously I'd been ignoring everything to do with stress for myself because it was all focused on her. And I'm still dealing with that now. It's probably about 3 years ago now. So 4 years in, I suddenly thought, I've had every medical intervention. I know this is not a clinical sinister issue. I have to now contemplate the fact that this is coming from my nervous system and my mental health. And so I'm going through counselling now to deal with the grief that I didn't really express at the time.
Yeah. Wow. No, that definitely sounds like a big impact. And yeah, it's, I don't want to liken your experience with type 1 diabetes to different things that I've had as a parent, in the situation of food allergies or pandas. But I can say that in talking to a lot of parents that have children that have went through health situations like in the pandas community, that a lot of those feelings I've heard as well, like sort of that, I was exactly the same in terms of like trying to, start my son with this great organic puree and things like that and getting everything perfect. And then it was sort of like, with pandas, the child has brain inflammation, and it was like, okay, now what? Like, I don't know how to, and it's a bit of a mystery at times in terms of diagnosis and even
Right.
treatment. And yeah, so I can completely identify with that, wanting to learn everything and going like hyperspeed, but then kind of also having that crash at some point as well.
Yeah, it wasn't sustainable. I think all parents whose children go through something serious and difficult and upsetting like that is not temporary, I think all of us go through very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about your family? Like, would you say that it's, been a bigger impact on, obviously your daughter, yourself? Has it had an impact on like that full family dynamic?
Oh, completely. Yeah, her younger brother, he was 6 or 7 at the time, and he was still very much a mommy's boy. We were very close, and he suddenly had to grow up and take more of a back seat. He didn't get me to himself anymore. She was very independent. He really needed me, and he lost that. And I do feel quite guilty still to the day, actually, about the fact that I suddenly wasn't there for him in exactly the same way as I had been before. But he equally really stepped up, and he's his sister's biggest advocate, and he totally gets it. He understands, and he's very considerate about it. He'll do anything she needs if she's really struggling because when you've got a low blood sugar, it can be dangerous to go anywhere, move your body, because you could make it worse, and that's when it gets very dangerous. But sometimes she'll maybe take advantage of that and just text him from her bedroom and go, can you please bring me some sugar? Yeah. And he will. He never complains. So, good and bad from that point of view. I do often talk about how, in fact, one of my best performing blog posts is a blog post about, I call it not drowning, but waving. The good things about having a type 1 diabetes diagnosis, and certainly pulling together as a family and being adventurous and pushing ourselves to find ways to do things, to not to defeat diabetes, but in spite of diabetes, that maybe we wouldn't have done if we'd just been an ordinary family. So there's positives, but yeah, it's put a massive strain on some of our relationships. I get upset that my relationship with her is often governed through necessity by conversations about her health. And as a teenager, she really doesn't want that input from me. Right. And I don't want to have to give it, but I still have this feeling that I've got a couple of years until she leaves home. Anything more I can instill into her brain before she goes off and has to do it for herself, I have to. And then stress on my relationship with my husband. We've obviously, my attention was diverted from everybody to her for a long time. We both took our own roles in managing her diabetes, and so we were quite. We were sort of on parallel paths, but not mixed. We were doing our separate things because there's such a lot to do. Yeah, it becomes all consuming. People will say it's like having a full-time job on top of a full-time job, and that's why a lot of people with type 1 diabetes burn out quite frequently. So we were burning out and didn't have time for each other.
Yeah, well, I think, again, as parents, that's definitely understandable. You're trying to divide and conquer where you can because you're trying to do the best for your child. So I can imagine that's challenging. Have you read my novel Pendulum by S.E. German yet? If not, what are you waiting for? And if you have, I would love to hear from you. If you don't know about Pendulum, it's a heartwarming story about a young boy who starts to experience neuropsychiatric symptoms after an infection. We follow the boy as he goes through many regular, real middle grade issues like moving, having a crush, playing sports, also while experiencing neuropsychiatric symptoms like anxiety, OCD, tics, panic attacks, and more. If you're interested in checking out Pendulum by S.E. German, it is available through Amazon worldwide, where you can even see a preview of the book, or you can listen to Chapter 1, which is on episode 64 of the Learning to Slay the Beast podcast. I hope you enjoy the novel, and thanks for your support. I wanted to ask a little bit about your daughter. Like you said that you're trying to, kind of instill a certain amount that you can as she's getting older before she probably leaves the nest. Did you notice a big transition as she moved from, a child to a tween to a teen? Like, is she, or did you notice more of a challenge, I guess, in terms of sort of that rigidity? Like I've heard around food allergies that there can be almost like a rebellious nature where they don't want to be as stringent about things. They kind of push back against some of the protocols. And I've heard that around pandas as well. I just wondered, is that the situation that you found too?
Yeah, to an extent. It's really common for teenagers with diabetes to just go, you know what, I'm sick of this. I do not want to be diabetic anymore. I'm not going to take my insulin. I'm not going to count my carbs. I'm just, I haven't died yet, so I'm probably going to be okay. And their control can go out of the window, and it is quite a dangerous time, young people with diabetes. And we've had elements of that. She's a really smart girl. I'm really lucky that she takes responsibility for herself. I wouldn't say she's rebelled. That definitely happens to some families. I wouldn't say rebellion is it. It's more minimizing it. Her life is very busy. She wants to be spontaneous because her friends are spontaneous. She wants to do the same as her friends. She wants to drink alcohol when her friends drink alcohol. All the things that teenagers are doing, she wants to be part of, and she really just wants to keep diabetes in its place enough that she can keep doing that. So I would say she's not 100% of the time focusing on the finer detail of it like I would. But then that's another thing that I've had to come to terms with, because whilst it's really hard to watch, knowing that if I was controlling this for her, I'd probably keep her in a slightly better range. I also want her to have a normal adolescence. I don't want her to grow up with stigma around her condition, and I don't want her to grow up thinking that her life is limited because of it, because that's when she'll start to really resent it, and that's when the rebellion could kick in at any point in her life, actually.
That makes sense. So trying to kind of keep her mindset almost around it as positive as possible. That absolutely makes sense. I wondered if you could talk about any of kind of the tools that you've used to support your family, like your child, yourself. You talked a little bit about moving into counseling and things like that, but have you had any other tools that have been really helpful?
Well, I mean, for me, it's definitely been the counselling. And that's a really long, deep process of unpicking a lot of stuff that I've locked away. For us as a family, and for her in particular, it's been having a very can-do attitude to everything. So this story will make people laugh, but it was horrible at the time. I laugh at myself for it now. But the night she was diagnosed, I followed people around the hospital, speaking to anyone who would speak to me about my daughter's diagnosis and whether or not she would be able to get drunk at university. She was 9 years old, bear this in mind. That was my very specific question. And it came from the fact that when I was at university, I had a friend who had type 1 diabetes who died in her sleep. And I knew that alcohol with insulin is it's a lethal combination. It has to be very carefully managed. But that kind of set the tone for how we've lived life since. So 2 days after she was diagnosed, And the day we were discharged from hospital, she was due to take a surfing simulation lesson. So she's 9 years old. She'd never surfed before. And we had this surf simulator, and she was booked to do it. She's that kind of girl. She's up for anything. And I said, well, we're going to do it. I don't care about this diagnosis. It is not stopping us. And so we all went off to the venue, and I took a great big holdall of medical supplies, including a sharps bin for the needles, which I wouldn't do now. I just keep them in my pocket till I get home and deal with them at home. But I had everything, and I had the rule book, and I was going according to, after every half hour during exercise, you stop, you test your blood sugar, you have a biscuit or whatever you have. And we did it, and it was terrifying. And I was in such a stressed state, and I stayed that way for the next 2 years, but partly because I was adamant, and so was she. And I told her this was not going to make her life less. It would make her life harder, but not less. And we've adopted that all the way through. So all the things that I didn't know she'd be able to do, and I still don't know how she's going to be able to go to university and be without me, but I know that she will, because I didn't know that she would be able to do her first residential trip with school at the age of 11. And she did. And I didn't know how she would be able to go abroad with her school. And she did. And I didn't know how she would ski with diabetes. And she did. And so I know that each time we get to another hurdle, it will happen, and we will be able to make it happen. And just as a kind of flip side to that coin, it's one of my pluses in that blog post. It's taught me to be less of a worrier in general. So I was a massive catastrophizer, as you can see from age 9. Will she be able to get drunk in 10 years' time? I've stopped worrying about things that are happening within anywhere outside of 2 months away from now. I don't worry about it. I know it's on my horizon. I know I'll worry about it when I get there, but I don't worry about it now because there's just no point.
That makes a lot of sense. And I really like that focus that, her life will not be less. I think that's what a lot of parents are thinking when they're trying to, put in that effort. That really touched me for sure. And the idea of the can-do attitude. And you're right. Like, you make it through, you figure it out, like as you get to all of those pieces. And that's great that she's been able to do all of those things, and you guys can support her through it. So yeah, you kind of touched on, some learnings through this journey, and I think that's really helpful. Is there anything else in that area that you'd want to share? Sounds like we should check out your blog post. Yeah, I think reach out to, and you're obviously doing the same thing. Reach out to communities who are dealing with the same as you. Because one of the things I found the hardest was that friends and family in my life didn't get it. Mm-hmm. They did not understand what we were going through. Some of them were judgmental and thought we were being too precious. We were overreacting. Especially because diabetes is one of those things that's quite often spoken about in the media, and it can be pejorative. Media hype can be all around, well, if you've got diabetes, it's your own fault, or it isn't that big a deal, you just eat some sugar. When in actual fact, it's life-threatening at every hour of every day, even when you're asleep. And I couldn't make anyone understand that. And it felt so lonely. Mm-hmm. People think they know. And I think it must feel the same with food allergies, I imagine. People think they know what it's about. And in reality, they have no idea. And you trying to explain it to them, for me, in some cases, it just caused me to be, I wouldn't want to go so far as to say ostracized, but I could tell that people felt uncomfortable with what I was saying. Mm-hmm. They either didn't believe me, or they thought I was becoming really high maintenance. And so I had to stop talking to some friends about it.
And that felt so incredibly lonely that at a time when I was desperate for support from the people in my life, I found myself having to explain myself to them and be accommodating to their feelings about it. So the only savior that I had in that was finding the Facebook groups full of the parents who knew exactly what we were dealing with, and they've become friends.
Yeah, absolutely. And it took me a long time to get there on the panda side and even the food allergy side to kind of find those Facebook groups. But I hear what you're saying. And I think one of the things I really railed up against is like, I didn't want to be while you're going through all of that, then also sort of judged as that mom, that's like, oh, she's over the top about this, or, like, as you mentioned, the food allergies, like, oh yeah, we have to hear about this guy. Like there's just so much judgment out there. And while you're already, going through, your own challenges. And so, yeah, I can really identify with that, finding the right community.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, you mentioned that your daughter is going to be transitioning probably out of the home soon. And I guess I'm just wondering where you feel in this journey, like you're being able to give time for your own self-care as she's getting older, it sounds like. Any other kind of important places that you are in this journey at this time?
I think so, but not probably to do with the diabetes. Actually, she's my eldest child, so I have about 18 months now until she will go away to university, and then my youngest child is nearly 15, so he'll be a couple of years behind her, and I'm, as most parents of teenagers that age are, I'm coming to the realization that my life as a parent is going to be not over, but very small compared to how it's been for the last 17 years. And that I need something else. I've started to feel that there is actually, I would say it's grief again. There's definitely some loss going on for me already, despite the fact that I haven't lost her. Because her life is busy with other people. She's quite frequently not here. She waitresses in a restaurant in the evenings, so she's not here in the evening. She's either working or she's with friends. She's really busy with work. And so actually we don't see a lot of her these days. And I spent quite a while being a bit mournful about that. And then I came to the conclusion that this actually is my learning curve. This is the thing that is going to make it feel less devastating on that day when I do drop her at university, because I'll be a little bit used to it by then. But in that process, I've decided, it's dawned on me that I need something else in my life. So as well as having counselling for myself, which I've found so useful. I've loved it so much and seen the benefit of it so much that I'm now training to be a counsellor.
Oh, wow.
So there's a positive in there. It's taken me to places that I might not have gone. It's taken me to difficult things that I didn't want to have to deal with. But through that, I've found probably the next career that I have. I was an operations director first, then I was a mother, and then I'm going to be a counsellor.
That's amazing. And I'm sure, you could give so much to parents that are going through any kind of a health issue with their child as well, with that too. Yeah,
that's well, I'd like to. It's just supporting people when they're in the most awful place of their lives and they just didn't want to be there, and just helping people through that to the other side.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. I guess before we wrap up, are there any additional tools or advice that you want to talk about in terms of health issues with children, or even if you want to talk a little bit about your blog and your podcast?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, what have I learned? I mean, the standard one with children is, as a mum, just trust your gut. Because I knew something was wrong, and I was being told it was probably just a bladder infection, or because when you've got type 1 diabetes, your symptoms are initially needing to drink a lot and go to the toilet a lot. So I was dismissed because it's not the most common diagnosis, but I knew it was more than that. And I hear that time and time again. People just know that there's something not right. So if you know that, then keep pushing. That's definitely a mantra for parenting generally. And then not being afraid to feel what you feel and be honest about what you feel, because I've found that's been the most dangerous thing, is to try and push my feelings aside, numb them, squash them, because they just keep popping up. So from the mental health point of view, just sit with your feelings if it's feeling difficult and acknowledge them and hear them out. And that's what I get from my guests on my podcast. So the podcast is called Teenage Kicks. And I interview adults who went through something tough as a teenager, and they tell me how it was, how it felt, and what they wish their parents had known at the time, as well as how they've come through it and what they've learned from it. So it's always quite a tough story. I've got some very tough stories on there, but it's always a really positive story. So just that time to reflect on difficult things and not try to avoid them, I would say is a good strategy.
That sounds great. And I'm sure a lot of that can be done through the counseling and all the things like that. But yeah, even just sitting with yourself for a little while, that makes sense. And I definitely experienced that myself with that listening to mother's intuition with both of the kids, like in both the food allergy situation and then also with the panda's diagnosis. Both times I was told, no, basically. And it was like, no, okay. You have to become an advocate. And that can be a really tough role, depending on your personality and all of that kind of stuff.
Yes, it's really tough. Actually, in terms of tools, learning to be confident as an advocate is so important, because I've had to do that so many times with school when they haven't taken it seriously. I'm sure you've been there.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. For sure on the food allergy side. And then it's been more of like an education role with pandas, because just it seems nobody knows as much about it. No, that's great advice. I think a lot of people will identify with your story and a lot of the tips and advice that you've kind of given today. I think that's really helpful. So if listeners do want to find out more about you, there's your blog, and then also the podcast, Teenage Kicks. Is there any other way on social media or online that they should look to connect with you?
Yeah, Instagram. That's where I hang out most of the time. I am Helen Wills on Instagram, and I talk about all sorts of things there. I talk about midlife fashion and not fading away into old age and just having more of a life to live. But I also talk about the kind of funny and difficult aspects of parenting teenagers, and a little bit about diabetes.
Oh, that sounds great. Okay, wonderful. I'm sure they will want to connect with you there. So thank you so much for your time today. I think this was great. Like I said, so much in here and so much that I personally identify with as well.
Thank you. It's been really lovely chatting to you.
Thank you so much to Helen Wills for her time today. I honestly learned so much about type 1 diabetes. I didn't really know that I did not understand this disorder. I didn't know it was an autoimmune condition. And hearing how challenging it can be to parent and try to manage that disorder, it really hit home. And I definitely can identify and see the challenges in doing that. And I hope that others who are maybe experiencing this have felt that sort of being seen when hearing Helen's story today. If you are looking to connect further with Helen and learn a lot more about her parenting tips and some of the work that she's doing in terms of understanding teens, you can connect with her on Instagram at I am Helen Wills. You can listen to her on the Teenage Kicks podcast, and I'm sure she's going to love to have you over there. And also find her blogging at Actually Mummy. I hope you enjoyed the show this week and that you also learned a lot about not only type 1 diabetes, but parenting during challenging times. Keep well, everyone, and have a great week. Are you interested in having a published author speak in your classroom or at your community event? I'd be interested in speaking about my new novel, Pendulum by S.E. German, the writing process, mental health, pandas, pans, podcasting, and more. Contact me at reallifeprojectco@gmail.com for both in-person and online bookings. Thank you for listening to the Learning to Slay the Beast podcast. Please keep in mind, this podcast is not intended to be medical or professional advice. If you'd like to hear more from me, you can follow me on social media, Instagram and TikTok at Sarah Lady Gluten, or Facebook, Sarah_gluten-free lady. You can also visit my website, which includes author information, speaking information, and more info on the podcast at www.se-german.com. If you like the podcast, please feel free to review the podcast on your favorite platform and also subscribe, because it means that it will show up for you every week on your favorite podcast platform. Also, we've just started to have the ability to support the podcast. You can find this link in my Instagram bio or visit Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/learning to slay the beasts. Thanks again for listening and have a great week.